I wrote "flower 4 days" in my little notebook, then watched the wind erase the road to Prairie Bend. Their paper said I had 1 sunrise to leave, and my stove smoked through a cracked seam, no matter how gentle I fed it. Each night, I drew a new snow mark on the doorframe, and Jonah's cough sounded thinner in the dark. If I misjudged the drift by even a hand's breadth, the cold would take the boy first. November 1883. Dakota Territory, Prairie. A few miles out from the hamlet, folks called Prairie Bend. Early snow skimmed the grass like salt, and the wind ran steady out of the northwest. Our rented claim sat on open ground where nothing broke a gust but distance. I was Agnes Hart, 59 years old, and the only grown soul left to keep a child through winter. Jonah was 8, slight as a willow switch, and trying hard not to tremble when the cold hit him. We had been pushed off the cabin by a rent man with a paper and a hard face, and we had nowhere solid to go. If the shelter I built did not hold against the first real blow, Jonah could slip into cold sleep, and we would lose him, and any chance of land for good. The eviction notice still flapped from the latch as we hauled our things out. Our one thin stove sat in the yard. Its pipe seam split, so it smoked even when the fire was small. We owned a hand saw with worn teeth, a spade with a loose handle, 1 quilt, and food that could not stretch past a few careful days. The road to Prairie Bend was already filling, and the next storm looked close enough to taste in the air. My duty was plain: caretaker, builder, and provider, with 4 days of flour left and fuel for only 2 cold nights if I fed the stove wrong. Jonah became my responsibility, the simple, ordinary way most burdens arrive. My daughter left in spring, saying she would return after the thaw, and never did. Jonah's father had been gone longer. Fever took him one winter, and a fall from a wagon finished what fever started. There was no grand tragedy to tell, only absence that stayed. So I kept the boy. I kept him because a child should not pay for a grown person's leaving. By 15:20 yesterday, Jonah and I had moved what we could carry. He held the oil lamp wrapped in cloth so its glass would not shatter. I carried the flour sack by the seam. The tag on it read, "Prairie Bend Mercantile, 50 pounds, though it was mostly empty now. We dragged a small iron skillet, a tin cup, a cracked brick for warmth, and my little notebook tied with twine. A man riding past laughed into his scarf and said we'd be buried honest. I did not answer him. I kept walking until the cabin sat behind us like a mistake I could no longer fix. The rent man had given me 1 sunrise. He stood with clean boots and a watch chain and said, "Winter don't change a contract." Then he put his finger on my patched roof, like it offended him. He did not say sorry. He only said, "You'll be gone." I did not beg. Begging costs more than it buys. I asked for the stove. He shrugged like a stove was nothing. So I took it and left the rest to the cold. I chose a shallow cut in the land where a low bank broke the wind a little. The sod there was tight, roots bound like rope. The ground held enough frost to make work hard, but not so much that the spade would bounce. At 16:10, I opened my small notebook and wrote our first proof line. November 12th, 1883. Flour 4 days if careful, wood 2 nights if stingy. Then I put the spade in the ground and leaned my weight into it. Sod lifted in blocks, heavy and alive with frozen roots. Each piece came up like a thick slice of bread, grass on top, dirt beneath. I had Jonah stack them on the windward side, no higher than his waist. "Grass to the wind," I told him. He nodded, lips pressed, working like a man twice his size. After 8 blocks, his arms began to shake, so I made him sit with his back against the bank. "Rest is work too," I said. He watched me cut and lift and stack. His eyes followed the spade blade the way a child watches a clock. Before sunset, a low wall faced northwest. I leaned 2 peeled poles against it, set a ridge pole, and kept the roof low so the wind would slide over instead of ripping. The hand saw squealed, but it bit if I let it. I cut the poles short so the roof would not carry too much snow. We covered the frame with grass mats and the quilt folded double, saving the driest side for inside. Then I mixed mud with snow in a hollow and slapped it into every gap until my fingers went numb. That mud was our mortar and our promise. A neighbor named Denny Clark stopped to watch, hands in his pockets. He was the kind of man who felt safer when someone else looked foolish. "That's a dog house, Agnes," he said. "Dogs got sense to crawl out when the weather turns." Jonah's shoulders drew up. I kept spreading mud and said, "Steady. Then it will be a warm one." Denny laughed, quick and sharp, and went home to his door that shut tight, and I set the stove inside, close to the sod wall, so the heat would push into earth. The stove door hinge was loose, and the pipe seam leaked. At 17:10, I wrapped the seam with a strip of damp cloth and smeared mud over it. I wrote another proof note. 17:10, stove seam, wrapped plus clayed. Smoke less if draft good. Then I fed the fire 1 stick at a time and watched the flame until it behaved. We ate cold the first evening. A heel of bread, a spoon of lard, and a pinch of salt on Jonah's tongue to keep his body from slipping. I did not light the lamp until full dark. Oil was for nights, not comfort. When I finally lit it, the small circle of light made our lean-to feel like a room. Within our first 20 lines of living, winter showed its teeth. The floor stayed so cold that Jonah's breath made a small cloud even under the quilt. His boot sole split at the toe, and the tear opened wider every time he shifted his feet. The lamp chimney had a hairline crack, and I could not afford it breaking. I tied it with twine and kept the flame low. Those were our first signals, small but sharp, saying, "Fix this now, or pay later." I sat Jonah close to the stove and patched the boot by lamplight. I counted each stitch under my breath. 27, 28. In the notebook I wrote, boot patch, 31 stitches, waxed thread. Proof mattered, even for a boot, because small failures become big ones in a storm. Jonah watched the needle and asked, "How many stitches make it strong?" "As many as it takes," I told him, "and no fewer." After midnight, the wind shifted and struck our lean-to full. The roof creaked once and settled. A snow hissed along the quilt and began to pile against the sod wall. Jonah slept in short starts. I lay awake and listened to his breath the way you listen to a fire, steady or failing. When he shivered, I pulled him closer. When he tried to apologize for being cold, I stopped him with one hand. "Children don't owe apologies," I said. "Only effort." At 3:40, the stove began to smoke. When I cracked the door, a thick roll of it came out, and the lamp flame leaned sideways. Snow had packed around the pipe outside and choked the draft. I dug a narrow trench out from the pipe with the spade, right through the drift, until the air moved again. Then I slapped fresh mud at the seam with fingers that barely worked. Jonah sat up, eyes wide. "It's hungry for air," I told him, and made him sip warm water from a tin cup before he lay back down. As before dawn, I marked the inside of our doorway with charcoal. One straight line and a date beside it. The drift was already halfway up the opening. That mark was not a prayer. It was measurement, and it told me what to do next. Morning came pale. The prairie was gone under white. Fence posts had vanished. The cabin on the rise looked farther away than yesterday, as if snow had stretched the land. Jonah coughed, dry and sharp. I felt his forehead and found heat building there. At 8:15 I wrote, "Cough plus fever starting. Keep stove steady. No running outside." Then I rationed like a miser. 1/2 cup flour for the day, 14 beans counted by hand, 1 spoon lard. At 11:50, I cooked a thin porridge and made Jonah eat slow. At 17:25, I recorded the ration line and checked a small box beside it, so fear could not rewrite my memory. And a quiet hour came near midday. I used it for work outside. I built a curved snow wall a few paces from our doorway, packed hard with the flat of the spade. Not tall, just enough to blunt the wind and keep the drift from sealing us shut too fast. Then I cleared a small ring around the stovepipe so air had a path. The work made my back ache, but it also made the shelter feel less like waiting. Mrs. Lottie Rusk stood at the edge of our drift and would not step closer. She kept her scarf high and her eyes low. "Folks say you're trespassing," she called. "Folks say you'll freeze to prove a point." I kept my voice calm. "I'm proving he can breathe," I said, and nodded toward Jonah under the quilt. Lottie shifted and set a small bag of dried apples in the snow without naming it. Then she walked off before I could thank her, or as if kindness had to be hidden from men like Denny Clark. That afternoon, Jonah tried to help and nearly toppled from dizziness. Fever had taken his legs. I eased him down and felt fear in my throat, sharp and hot. Fever in cold country is a thief. It steals strength and makes breath thin. I cooled his brow with a damp cloth and warmed a flat stone on the stove for his feet. At 2100, I wrapped the stone in cloth and slid it beside him. He whispered, "Are we going to die out here?" "No," I said, "not tonight. We're building nights, one at a time." He stared at the sod wall like it might answer. Then he closed his eyes and tried. On the second night, the wind pressed steadier. The lean-to held, but the floor sucked heat away. So I dug, careful. With the spade, I scraped a shallow pit inside, just enough to set the stove lower than Jonah's bedroll. Warm air belongs where bodies are, not up at the roof. The change was small, but I felt it in Jonah's shoulders when he finally unclenched. After midnight, snow rose again. I woke at 2:10 to a slow shush as the drift slid along the roof. I checked the pole above my head, then checked Jonah. His breath paused once, longer than I liked, then returned. I did not let panic speak. I only fed the stove, then wrote, 2:20, breath pause once, keep heat steady. A note like that was a rope I could grab when fear tried to pull me under. The next day, Denny Clark came close enough to see our doorway marks. He smirked. "Markin' your grave?" he said. I stood up slow so my joints would not betray me. "These are drift marks," I said. so I know when to dig." He snorted. "And you'll be dug out in spring," he said, "and no one will claim you." I looked him straight on. "Then you'll have to explain to the Lord why you stood warm and watched," I said. Denny's smile thinned. He turned away, because men like him do not like hearing their own smallness named. By late afternoon, clouds thickened low, and the air felt heavy. The wind wires on the fence line, what I could still see of them, began to hum. Prairie Bend's church bell rang once, far off, then stopped. I took that as a sign of the door being barred, not rescue. The blizzard arrived the next evening without drama. A sound like far sand became a steady roar. Snow began to pile against the sod wall with a weight I could feel through my back. By 1:30, the doorway drifted shut, and the lamp flame weakened. I understood quick. Warmth without air is a trap. From inside, I dug a breathing tunnel through the packed snow, pushing it out in blind scoops. The spade handle slipped in my wet mittens. Each scoop fell back in like water. Still, I did not stop. At 2:45, I broke through, and cold air rushed in like a slap. But the stove drew clean again. I packed the snow I'd pulled inside against the sod wall to melt slow, using it as insulation instead of letting it soak our bedding. Near 4:50, the roof began to sag under weight. I could feel it in the pole above my head. So I pushed up from inside with the spade blade, carving the drift off in short bursts until it slid away outside. Between bursts, I checked Jonah's breath. Shallow, but steady. He made a small sound, and his hand searched for mine. I held it until his fingers warmed again. I wrote a quick note by lamplight, and 4:50, air tunnel dug, roof cleared from inside, Jonah breathing shallow but steady. Then I sat with my back to the sod wall and kept listening. Before dawn, the drift climbed above my second mark. I made a third line on the doorframe and wrote the date beside it. The charcoal rubbed onto my thumb. I stared at the line a moment. A line is a small thing. In winter, a small thing can keep you alive. By first light, the storm eased. Outside, the old cabin on the rise was only a white lump, chimney, lost. A neighbor's voice shouted somewhere in the drifts. I stepped out into waist-deep snow and saw Mr. Harland struggling toward me with a shovel. His face was gray with fear. "Our door's buried," he said. "My wife's coughing. Chimney won't draw." He looked at our low roof and stared like he could not believe it was still there, and I left Jonah wrapped tight with the lamp low and followed Harland through the drifts. At 13:40, We dug his door clear enough to open. Snow had choked his pipe outside, same as ours. I cut a channel, cleared the rise, and packed a small snow wall at his doorway to slow the drift. Harlan's wife coughed behind her shawl, eyes watery, lips cracked. I softened one dried apple in warm water and held it to her mouth. She took one bite and swallowed like it was medicine. Harlan's hands shook when his stove finally drew. "You didn't have to," he said. "A child doesn't choose the weather," I answered. "And neither does a woman." When I returned, Jonah was waiting, pale but awake. His first question was small. "Did they stop laughing?" "Not yet," I said, "but they're quieter." He stared at the ceiling and whispered, "I like quiet." "So do I told him. Quiet means we can hear what matters. That night, the sky cleared. Clear cold is the kind that cracks wood. I fed the stove with our last proper sticks. At 22:30, Jonah's fever eased, and sweat dampened his hair. I changed the cloth on his brow, dried his shirt by the stove, and kept him from chilling again. I wrote, 22:45, fever easing, change cloth, keep him dry. Then I wrote another line. Snow mark, third line, higher than Jonah's knee. It mattered to record it, not for anyone else, for us. By 17:05, the clear cold began to bite through the mud seams. A thin frost line crept along the inside sod where the heat could not quite reach. I tore a narrow strip from an old flour sack and hung it as a curtain behind the stove, making a smaller corner for warmth. Then I warmed the cracked brick on the stovetop and set it near Jonah's ribs so the heat would rise with his breath. In the notebook, I wrote, 17:20, frost line inside wall, hung curtain, brick warmed. The line on the wall stayed, but Jonah's shivering eased. And that was enough. 2 days later, Mr. Pike came in a wagon with 2 men and a paper in his hand. He stood by our snow wall like he was inspecting a bruise. "You're off the claim," he said. "Arrears. $12 by December 1st, or you're gone for good." Then he glanced at Jonah and added, "That boy will be a burden." I kept my voice even. "He's 8, I said, "and proper is what holds in weather." Pike's mouth tightened. He left the paper and drove away, as if winter itself would enforce his words. That afternoon, Denny Clark passed by and called out, "Hear that? $12 for your doghouse?" Jonah looked down at his hands. I touched his shoulder. 12 is just a number, I said. It can be built. I meant it. Saying a thing out loud is the first nail you drive. At 2010, I drew 12 small circles in my notebook, 1 for each dollar. Then I wrote, Work, trade, record. Numbers gave my fear a shape I could aim at. The last days of November were hard and plain. When the road opened as a narrow trench, I went to town for a few hours at a time. I left Jonah with Harlan's wife, who warmed to him once his fever lifted. I walked into Prairie Bend with my patched coat and my mended boots, and kept my head up. At the mercantile, Mr. Lyle weighed flour with a scale that always favored him. He tried to short me, and I showed him the flour sack tag stitched into my notebook and the dated weight note beneath it. His eyes narrowed. Then his scale suddenly behaved. I wrote, November 20th, scale corrected, got full weight, because memory alone is easy to argue with. Cash was rare in my pocket. What I had were hands, so I offered mending. Men laughed until their sleeves tore and their children's mittens split. Then they paid in small things. A trade chit here, a jar of rendered fat there. At 11:30 on a cold Thursday, Mrs. Rusk slipped me a store trade chit, stamped and smudged. 2 pounds flour, it read. I tucked it into my notebook and wrote, Chit received, Rusk, 2 pounds flour, owed quilt patch. Later, by lamplight, I patched her quilt with a square of my own worn skirt hem and counted the stitches the way I always did. And in the notebook, quilt patch, 44 stitches, paid Rusk. Back at the lean-to, I kept building. I raised the sod wall 1 block higher, but not too high. Height catches wind. Low survives. I added a pole brace at the corner where the first storm had pressed. At 6:10 one morning, I reclayed the stove seam and wrote, 6:10, seam reclayed, no smoke. At 17:45 another day, I lifted the pipe and scraped soot with a twig, and wrote that too. Those notes were my insurance against fire and against forgetting what worked. Jonah grew stronger. He began to take pride in the drift marks. Each evening, before I banked the stove, he checked the doorframe and made a fresh charcoal line if the snow had climbed. Higher, he would say, amazed. Or lower, he would say, relieved. We measured winter the way men measure fences, 1 mark at a time. A mockery did not stop all at once. One bright day, Denny Clark rode into town and said loud, Agnes Hart's raising a prairie mole. Some laughed. A few did not. I heard it while buying lamp oil. My cheeks warmed with shame and anger both. I did not answer him in the street. Later, when Jonah asked what they said, I told him, they said words. And what are words? he asked. Light, I said, or smoke, depends on who makes them. He smiled, small and tired, and leaned closer to the stove. Time kept moving, whether we were ready or not. By November 27th, I had earned $7. 7 circles crossed out. 5 remained. The sky lowered again, and I could feel another blow gathering like a fist. On November 28th, at 9:20, Mr. Lyle offered me a job no one else wanted. His storehouse shed roof leaked onto his surplus sacks. "And I'll pay you $2 to patch it," he said, like it was a joke. Women did not climb roofs in his mind. Old women, least of all. I thought of Jonah's breath in the blizzard. I said, "I'll do it." The shed roof was slick with frost. I climbed slow, kept my weight low, and hammered a patchboard in place. I warmed pine tar by the store stove so it would spread, then smeared it along the seam. By 12:15, I stood on the ground again, with aching knees. Mr. Lyle handed me $2 silver without looking me in the eye. I wrote right there, November 28th, 12:15, earned $2, roof patch, paid. Proof again. Not because I distrusted my memory, because a world that dismisses you will also pretend you never worked. Now I had 9. 3 remained. On November 30th, with the cold sharpening and the deadline near, I went to Harland. "Give me work for $3, I said. He blinked like he had not heard a woman speak so direct. Then he looked toward his barn. Cattle shifted, restless in the pen. "Stack sod along my barn wall," he said. "Windbreak. I never got to it last year." Sod again. The same earth folks mocked. I nodded. "I'll do it." We hauled the sod with his wagon, Jonah beside me, cheeks pink from effort. The creek bank was icy. We slipped once and laughed once, because laughter is also heat. By 1810, the sod was stacked tight along Harland's barn wall. Harland pressed $3 into my palm without making me ask twice. In my notebook, I crossed the last circles and wrote, November 30th, 1810, earned $3, sod stacked, total $12. December 1st came gray and still. At 10:40, Jonah walked beside me into Prairie Bend, carrying the notebook like it was a document. In Pike's office, I laid $12 on his desk, 1 coin at a time. The sound was small, but it held. I opened the notebook and let the dated lines speak for me. Pike counted twice, scowling. Then he pushed a paper forward. "Winter tenancy," he said, sharp. "Until thaw." I signed without begging, because enough is still a kind of victory. Outside, Jonah squeezed my hand. "Does that mean we can go back?" he asked. "Not back," I said. "Forward." We did not return to the old cabin that winter. It sat half-buried and full of mice, and I would not gamble Jonah's lungs for pride. Instead, we improved the lean-to until it was more than a joke. Harland brought 2 boards for a better door flap. A Lottie Rusk left a jar of preserved turnips at our snow wall one evening and walked away before I could see her face. Even Denny Clark stopped calling it a doghouse once he watched our roof ride a hard wind with the steadiness of something meant to last. One night, after midnight, the wind tried again. It pressed and prowled and then moved on. The stove held. The seam did not smoke. Jonah slept through it, mouth relaxed, hands warm. In the morning, he marked the doorframe and grinned. "Still here," he said. "Still here," I answered. On the last sharp night before thaw, at 20:30, I opened my notebook and read the first line from November. "Flour 4 days, if careful. Wood 2 nights, if stingy." Then I looked around our lean-to, now lined with extra sod, a better door flap, a dry corner for Jonah's, boots. I wrote one final proof line. "A shelter held, boy held. We will keep building." Jonah leaned warm against my shoulder, alive enough to argue about who got the last spoon of porridge. Outside, the prairie wind moved over our low roof the way water moves over stone. Low things endure. If you want another calm frontier survival story like this, subscribe and come back for the next one.